Thank you everyone for that's tuning in right now. I'm watching the participants counter jump up, about to breach 100. And thank you very much to the Yale SOM Alumni Network for calling on this and putting this panel together. So as Brent said, my name is Alex Burnap. I'm a professor here at Yale. So I'm in the marketing department. Over the last decade, I've worked in generative AI, primarily on the technical side and the engineering side for new product design. Currently working right now on large language models, which we'll talk about a bunch today, including how to persuade people and some of the risks with that. And more importantly, I'm very excited to introduce a couple of our panelists right now. James Lin, class of 15, and Jonas Dahl, class of 14. One comment. Unfortunately, our third panelist, Jennifer Peterson, was not able to make it today due to a last-minute urgent thing that came up. But without further ado, James and Jonas, would you like to kind of introduce yourselves, tell us how you're working with generative AI and how you got there? Maybe James first.
Okay, sure. My name is James Lin. I'm the head of AI ML innovation at Experian. As you all know, Experian is kind of a financial services company that kind of does your credit scores in North America, although if there are internationals. It's also an international company, so we do have several credit score products in other parts of the world as well. For me, I got the role because after SOM, I kind of started doing AI work at Experian, and I kind of pioneered the migration of AI into the cloud, as well as the kind of first-gen ML ops product. So that's kind of how we got into the overall role, which is greater than, I guess, just generative AI. But ever since that thing happened November last year, it's kind of been maybe 95% all generative AI. So that's kind of what I work on today. Over to you, Jonas.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm a product manager with Microsoft. I am working in our dynamics section, so basically on our CDP, customer data platform product. And just to give you a sense of what that is, the promise is to bring in data from disparate sources. So let's say our customers have CRM systems, they have data from transactional data, they will have data from the call centers, et cetera, and that lives in different places. And what our product does is it kind of combines all of that. So you have a 360 degree of the customer that you can use for marketing, et cetera. Before that, I was at Adobe, where I worked on an AI for our content management systems. So basically things like image tagging, et cetera. And it's really interesting to see that, having worked in AI for the last 10 years, it's I spent let's say the last 9 years on more of like predictive things, image tagging, et cetera. And really, Gen AI was in its infancy when I left Adobe 3 years ago and came to Microsoft. And it's just really amazing to see this complete shift to large language models and just the excitement that has brought. I'm super excited about it. And yeah, so I'm really looking forward to this talk, and thanks for the invite.
Great. Well, I think a lot of us, particularly in the audience, are also really hyped for Gen AI. Last few years, definitely on the public consciousness there. Maybe back to James. You want to talk a little bit in general how you're seeing adoption of Gen AI at Experian, and particularly both at the company but also the org that you're managing right now?
Yeah, so I think in the financial services space, there's a lot of excitement around it. It's also couched with a lot of pessimism and worry around kind of the potential leakage of sensitive, customer information. So the problem isn't so much if we're going to do it, it's more like a how or when we're comfortable enough to get to that point. It's largely around, like understanding how the models work to generate the synthetic information, and making sure that that output isn't kind of misleading or leaking anything potentially sensitive. And then maybe establishing the controls around that to get it to work. So, and I'm guessing there's a lot of other industries like medical that is similar, that we've heard. That's kind of like what the main focus is. Obviously, there's also the whole we want to put our domain specific knowledge or branding around the answers as well. So that kind of changes the ecosystem in like when you go how to deploy also, because there's a lot of decision making process and I guess strategic decisions around like how you accomplish that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. So I'm really glad you brought that up. We're going to try to talk about both regulatory issues if you're in very regulated industries like James with generative AI, as well as some of the privacy risks later. James, I hate to put you on the spot here again. You did mention kind of some of the maybe domain specific training. Would you mind giving kind of a high level idea of what it means to take a large language model, like a foundation model, just for our audience, taking that off and kind of training or the fine tuning you might be doing afterward?
Yeah, I guess just to establish maybe some of the vernacular that we'll talk about. So when you talk about deploying the whole product of a large language model, there's kind of the model or the base model itself, which we call the foundation model. So that's maybe like the GPT in terms of the things that people are most familiar with. It could also be Llama, which is more of an open source product that Meta released. So those two kind of seem to be the leading to like of a commercial versus like an open source at this point. And the difference between that is like GPT is controlled by Microsoft or OpenAI, so you don't really get a lot of control over it, whereas you can do a lot more with the fine tuning on something like Llama. And when we say fine tuning, what that means is you're adjusting kind of the structure of the response in a way that is more like what you want the model to deliver. In addition to that, there's something called a vector database. And there's something called retrieval augmented generation, which we won't get too much into, but essentially the database feeds the RAG, which is, I think most people call it grounding, but that's what ensures a more consistent response. And it's almost like a competing model to the actual large language model, in which you can choose kind of the right answer, so to speak, for that deployment.
Okay, cool. Yes. So just to sum up again, vernacular we had, often we'll take this kind of uncut diamond, GPT or Llama 2. Just as a side note to the audience, there's over 150,000 large language models out there. So while many of us have heard of, obviously GPT 3.5, 4, et cetera, there's a lot out there. But I think what James, we'll jump in the weeds later, but the idea of taking the uncut diamond, putting your own company's data in, cutting it down so this thing does a specific task for your company. So thank you. Just setting up some baselines here. Can we pass it back to Jonas now? Back to that same question. How are you seeing? I mean, you're obviously at Microsoft now, backer of OpenAI. How are you seeing adoption of Gen AI, both at the company level, but maybe also in your product org?
Sure. So yeah, naturally, there's a strong focus on Gen AI at Microsoft, just giving the relationship with OpenAI and also just the promise of the technology in general. When you see it, look at our competitors, it's very hyped and significant resources are put behind this, of course. So yeah, see a lot of activity. And I think a very interesting thing about this is, as I mentioned before, most people are, beginners, actually, right? I feel like even though I've been in this field for a decade, I'm also a beginner because most people are not focused on large language models until ChatGPT, basically, right? So I think that's really interesting and excites me. That it's very kind of unexplored. So there's a lot of excitement there. I would say in general, we are focused on learning, basically running lots of experiments and figuring out how can we solve problems with this technology, how can we improve the product, and just help our users get more done in the end. So that's really really interesting. And then also personally, I can speak for myself, but also I see my coworkers. We're also experimenting with large language models for just doing our day-to-day tasks. So I think we will come probably back to that later in the talk. But just I used it a little bit to prep for this discussion, right? I'm using it to query our telemetry system to just make me more efficient. So I think it's kind of going into a lot of the organization in a very broad sense, and I'm really excited to see how does this look like 3 years out, 5 years out.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, so as Jonas was saying, we'll come back to some of the more specific use cases, particularly the product management area that I also am quite interested in. Maybe back to James here. You mentioned some of the, you brought up both GPT and kind of these commercial cloud offerings, including some of your previous work experience there, migrating things to the cloud. But this this decision sounds like you all made with kind of this commercial paid for product where you don't have access to the actual neural network or the large language model itself versus using an in-house, using your own engineers to train your own large language models for your more specific tasks. Maybe, this is kind of a general strategic decision. I think a lot of companies, including many of the companies our audience members are in, between these two, the commercial versus open source in-house. James, you want to talk a little bit about some of the thought process there, considerations and trade-offs?
Yeah. So first, I just want to go back to what Jenna said, in that everyone is kind of new to this, and yeah, that's definitely true. I think strategically the most important thing is to remain flexible, because nobody knows what's around the corner. Like even I'm sure with Microsoft leading, they probably don't know what like everybody else and literally everyone is doing something, is around the corner. So the main thing is to like not make decisions that you can't back out of if something better comes along, in a week or a month, right? So like to that extent, we're actually doing both. we're not only doing like the paid model or commercial model, we're also doing the open source. It's the establishment of a methodology in which you can easily pivot to do all of the different options, which seems to be like the best long-term solution. And with that, then you kind of question like, well, what are the assets, right? Because like normally you think the model or like the product is kind of like the main asset. The way that we're looking at it is more that the data that you are enriching, that you're then feeding into these models to do the tuning or the grounding, that's actually the core asset that you want to develop and build all of the framework around, because that's what gives you kind of like the structure to handle all the different solutions.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of leading into the second question, but do you, based on tailoring, LM for your company's data, do you mind, are you able to share any kind of more specific examples of what you mean by that, or as it relates to especially the strategic decision between open source, in-house?
Yeah, sure. So I think this gets a little bit into the weeds, but when you look at the different methods of doing things, there's, again, this is like a area that changes every day, basically, or every week. But what we found is like when you're doing fine tuning, instead of doing kind of a more unsupervised approach, which is how we understood GPT to be done, it's better to kind of tailor your responses to fine tune in an instruction based format. So like there's a bunch of research out there on that. But doing that requires a lot of manual human intervention, which is also what is needed for when you're establishing your vector databases and doing the grounding, because that's kind of like your domain specific knowledge. So in that way, you also have to create a structure in which you're doing that activity as well. So basically what we're seeing is that the subject matter experts who are like the product specialists, either the business analysts, the product managers, need to become a lot more involved into like the actual development, so to speak, in terms of getting that data ready. And I think like when we talk about, people probably heard that like you have to have your data cleaned in order to do AI or ML. But what we're finding is that for large language models, there's a different level of cleanliness, like a new one on top of that. That needs to be done. And in addition to that, it's basically for us a new data set, because we usually in the past have been more focused on financial and numeric data, whereas obviously the large language models are primarily natural language based.
Okay, very cool. Thank you. So just maybe to give a more, maybe you're not able to talk so much. I know both of you and Jonas, NDAs and whatnot, talk a specific example, but just would you let me set up a concrete.
Oh yeah, I could give an example too. Yeah. So you know, I guess the most common example I always say is this, right? It's like everyone who always talks Experian will say like, hey, how do I improve my credit score? So there's a very public answer that we can give to, you know, like it's probably on the website even in the FAQ. Like it's probably question number 1 on the FAQ, right? That's like the normal standard answer. If you asked our bot that we have it, it's probably going to say exactly that answer. But internally, we actually know all the inner workings, right? And there's actually an encrypted document that only a few people have access to, which is written in natural language, which would get integrated into an internal deployment, right? So I can't actually tell you like the secret sauce, so to speak, but like that, like as a concrete example, like handling that procedure and ingesting it into the model is something that we would do as like an internal deployment versus external.
Okay. Well, you know, I was going to pass it back to Jonas here, but I think it's a little bit of a conflict of interest if I'm talking to someone from Microsoft about commercial versus open source, the strategic decision. But maybe I'd like to build on, Jonas, given your background in product.
I was going to say, I think you should ask him because like Meta is also a commercial company and they have open source. So like, there's no reason Microsoft couldn't, just throwing it out there.
Yeah. So, okay. Why don't we pass it over? Let me just give a quick comment in the meantime. I think it's very interesting. So if you've watched these large language models evolve from, honestly, way before some of the GPT architecture, transformers and whatnot over the last decade, you see them diverge in these different model classes, but maybe even more interestingly, the big tech companies that are really pushing the innovation forward, they have very different policies on whether they're open sourcing things. So for example, Llama 2, as James has brought up, this open source model, honestly, I'm also training this model at Yale in the research cluster. Some of these things were closed source, and then they open source them after OpenAI originally, put their product out, but kept it closed source. So these kind of competitive dynamics are there, which might be interesting to comment on later. Anyways, I'm doing too much talking. Jonas, could we kind of swap it back to you here? Same question on this trade-off.
Yeah, sure. So maybe I should say just a disclaimer, I'm not a Microsoft spokesperson or anything like that. So these are just my remarks, my personal remarks. And I'm also not, part of the decision making in terms of open source, closed source, all of that stuff. So for us, of course, we have a different level of access. So it's not really too much of a consideration for us. Of course, we're using our own in-house models. I don't know if I can speak to, just in general terms. Of course, it makes sense that for some applications you want to look under the hood and understand everything that's going on. For some applications, it's fine to just have a black box that you're using. So I think it really depends on the use cases, right? So yeah, I think that's all I can say on that topic.
Fair. It's a fair answer. Well, maybe we can dive into the weeds just a little bit more with this, using your company's specific data. Really stepping back, saying, well, how would I use in a large language model at my job? So maybe back to James, what does that process look? You talked a lot about the data and how those kind of from a strategic level, you and your team are saying it's not the model, it's not the GPT-4 or Llama 2, it's the data that's the secret sauce for you and gives you flexibility moving forward. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I guess going back a little bit into the how it works, there's basically something called embeddings, which is what the kind of the core database of knowledge is that any model relies on. I'd almost think of it as like the encyclopedia, right? That as the reference, and then there's like some search function effectively that's going on that triggers that's kind of looking up what the answer is when you ask it a question. So when we talk about foundation models, the people who are releasing those have already done like terabytes and like even maybe petabytes of data that have been used to embed kind of like that base level of knowledge. And usually it doesn't include like your company specific information, right? So when we look at how to add that, I think the first gen, a lot of people thought we can fine tune that in there. And I think there's a technique within fine tuning called transfer learning, which is supposed to do that. But when you experiment with that, you find that it really doesn't work very well because that at the base, at the core is not an embedding, right? So then the question comes, how do you actually do the embeddings? And that's where the RAG comes in, or again, retrieval augmented generation, right? So you then embed just your kind of core company documents and put it in a different database. And then when you serve the model to the customer, you kind of need to do like it's all kind of done automatically. I don't know that you guys have to worry about details, but you basically decide, do I take the model's answer or do I take the database's answer, right? And if you map the question to like a company domain thing, then you take the answer from your database. Whereas if you're if you want just like the sentence structure to make it sound in the way that sounds more professional or friendly or whatever, then you would take the response from the model instead. So that's kind of like in a nutshell how it works. But then in terms of like how you prepare your data for that, we've had to go a lot into data labeling in order to help augment that. So data labeling, or as we call it, annotation, and maybe Jonas does too, since Europeans call it that. I think it's a process where someone like a human is in the loop in looking at the data and making a determination as to like say what is the best answer, or just if the answer was correct or incorrect to begin with, right? But like there are platforms and plenty of providers out there that help do that. You could even do it yourself. But but I think that becomes a big part of the strategy because you're asking a human to take their time to do that. So it's actually creating a lot of work that wasn't in the product design process initially. That companies have to account for. And it's kind of one of those things where the investment in time to do that needs to reflect the process. And I think you also have to combat like the human fatigue element, right? Because like when humans are doing this annotation thing, it's a very tedious and remote, like repetitive task. So the quality can go down as it goes as well. So those are like the problems there in terms of like getting to market quickly because it relies on the human element so much. And I think if you look it up, like Databricks, which is again one of the companies in this space, when they did this and released their data set for this, they had to have like a contest internally within their employees and incentivize them to do it because it was such like a repetitive task, right? So that's kind of like what we've seen
Okay, and I just want to throw a little bit of maybe background knowledge in for the audience again. We're kind of focused on using your company's data to tailor what is really a more general large language model, a foundation model off the shelf. Take it, as James was talking about, this very intense human labeling process where you take your own company's data, clean it up, label it. So to give a concrete example, let's say I was Amazon, let's say I was Yelp, and I had different restaurants, and my company's data was reviews on different restaurants, and I wanted to use, let's say, a large language model to summarize reviews, tell me about these restaurants. This manual process of labeling different reviews as, let's say, helpful or good summaries or not, very time intensive, it sounds like. Is that right, James? Is that a fair?
Yeah, I mean, so where a lot of my research actually is going right now is in how to speed up that process or make it more effective. So that's definitely where we're seeing a lot of areas for development. I don't know that every company would want to invest similarly, because I think we are in a unique position where we have to due to the regulatory concerns. But for other companies, I think solutions will come out from the providers that will, like they don't necessarily have to do that organic development on their own. I'm sure I know Microsoft is doing something as a whole. Also, I should say I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'd love to come back to Microsoft and the way they're doing kind of the reinforcement learning with human feedback and obviously the model, but I kind of want to go back and hone in on to switch, pass this back to Jonas, but you mentioned a really interesting thing of how many stakeholders need to be involved in this process of curating your company's data so you can tailor a general large language model for your company's tasks. And you said, hey, you got to involve all kinds of stakeholders, maybe outside the typical process. You have product managers there, maybe legal, sales, and whatnot. Jonas, do you mind kind of taking that question from there? What is the role of both product management as well as other stakeholders and adjacent roles to this process?
Sure. I think like the key thing for a product manager, the way I see it for something like this, is to put all the data related questions at the top of the agenda. So things like privacy, consent, biases, fairness, all of this stuff, put it at the front of the project. I feel like, during my, just what I've seen in the past, a lot of projects were like built out of excitement, and then you would kind of worry about, all these aspects later on, and it can turn into, a complete mess and be very, very painful if you don't consider that up front. So I think that's a complete change in mentality for product managers, but across the board for researchers and everyone. Everyone's aware that you need to think about how the data is sourced and all of these things up front. So I would say, if I have to point out one thing, that's key, right? We're really lucky to be, I work in an organization where we have dedicated privacy teams and things of that nature. So we get a lot of support. So we can, I can focus more on like the product specifics. So very, grateful for that. But yeah, it's certainly something that requires, I would say, a lot of education, right? Because there's so, as you said, there's so many different stakeholders involved, and it's just really important that there's a focus on these things. I think I'd add another thing, that what we're doing in our product is also, we are also not only dealing with our own data, right? Because we also have customers who want to, we're facilitating them to, we're empowering them. And that also requires, a set of, I would say, guidelines, rules, etc., to handle that in a meaningful way, and also just to increase your chances of success requires a lot of rigor and different kind of thinking when you're dealing with data sets that you don't necessarily own, or you don't necessarily have a good sense of what's actually in there. So that's just another layer on top of that. And just there are different things you can do there. I just want to mention one of the things we do a lot is to allow our customers to map their data to what we call the common data model. So basically that's semantics on top of their data. So we understand, basically, if you think about data as a giant Excel spreadsheet, what's in the different columns and things of that nature, just kind of needs to be accepted across the board, and people need to understand these ways of doing things. So yeah, sorry, that was a long, convoluted answer, but it's also a pretty complex problem.
No, don't apologize. Hey, those fantastic answers. I just want to kind of sum up. James and Jonas both. I guess we've been talking a little bit about kind of strategic considerations and things to keep in mind if a company's going to deploy an LLM, within their product. And it sounds like one of these stepping back, one of these strategic decisions: do we go with open source model that we can download, in-house train, and do this very expensive data manual annotation process to train it? The other strategic decision, building off you all, sounds like, versus other maybe product development processes, integrating LLMs or this type of innovation needs a lot of stakeholders right up at the front, right? You have the product managers and whatnot helping guide, the training process, keep some of the biases out of there. Is that a fair assessment?
If you're a large company, you definitely need alignment within, like, almost from the top level, to kind of have a lot of buy-in, right? Like if there's a detractor who is like one of the key stakeholders, like you're not gonna get it done. But I guess just to go slightly correct what you said there, even if you go with like OpenAI, you still have to do the retrieval augmented generation if you're going to do your companies. So that problem exists like independently, right? I think what you get out of what you can skip a little bit with going down the path of a more commercial model is less of the fine tuning, right? Because they've kind of done that for you. And just to answer some of the questions that we have, so like I think what we talk about makes it sound very difficult and like hard to get into. It's actually really easy. Like so when we do like our proof of concepts internally, like at this point, like we can probably within 1 week set up a POC of an open source and get it to do what we want it to say for like that kind of on Rails experience. It's like when you're trying to go to production, that's very difficult. So the key resource is something called Hugging Face. It is like an open source repo that has like all the code that you can pull down. I see Alex is smiling because he probably uses it. But yeah, so it has a tool for everything. The actual hard part is filtering out the noise, because a lot of people check in code there and you don't know which one is like the realistic one or not. But also, like when we're talking about models, like it's not like they're all huge ones like GPT for which you hear, like I think costs like $100,000 a day to maintain. like you can run it on your local computer. So if you download like Llama 2 7 billion, it's actually performs really well. And you can run it on your local computer, like laptop even. Like I've run it on my laptop. So there's not actually that high of a barrier to get it done. And you can probably sign up for a cloud like AWS account or Microsoft Azure account or Google Cloud account, right? And it'll if you need to do some fine tuning, like you probably pay $10 to $20 and it'll do it for you, right? So the barrier is actually pretty low. I don't know, Alex, since you said you're working on it, if you have any.
Yeah, I don't want to build on too much. I did, before we have time for audience questions, maybe last 10, 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, I saw a lot of questions here in the chat already about really what was the next topic I think we should move into, which is things of, what are the risks? What are the things we need to keep in mind if we're thinking of integrating LLMs into our company or workflow? Specifically risks based around hallucination, I see in the chat, meaning, hey, these things put out misinformation or fake news all the time, much more so than I think a lot of us expect, at least before we start working with them. So hallucinations, as well as the biases, as brought up in the chat. I'm gonna, maybe I'll say a quick thing on those too. So we'll switch down to a little bit of some of the risks to keep in mind. So as far as let's start with maybe biases. I'll say a couple things. So the current, even the most sophisticated LLMs right now, the GPT-4s, Llama 2, as you brought up, are incredibly biased. And what do we mean by that? So if I think of the training process for these models as a few stages. One, training the base model, the foundation model, train on basically the text on the internet, followed by another couple steps, supervised fine tuning. So a much smaller data set that's been curated, and then finally a final step, reinforcement learning to ensure that the output is, let's say, not spitting vitriol and hopefully less fake news. Between these three phases, the bias changes a lot. So let me just give a quick comment. A very recent research study put out by a team at Stanford found that the bias, and when I say bias, I mean how representative of is a large language model like ChatGPT of, let's say, citizens in the United States. The bias put out by these large language models, study across, I think this case was 9 different LLMs, showed that the output was as biased as Democrats and Republicans are, on gun control. So very biased, and these LLMs tend to be biased toward the majority viewpoint. So right now, for example, GPT-4 will give an alignment of saying an over 99% approval rating of Joe Biden, when if you look up, I looked at Reuters pretty recently, it's about 40 to 45%. So they're very biased in a certain way. I'm done talking here. I want to kind of pass it back to you all. And how do you think about bias within these models? How would you think about them, mitigating some of these biases, or at least managing them in a production environment? These risks.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's important to think about the specifics of the use cases, because I think that's really a good way to manage some of these things, and just thinking about the risk. So for example, let's say I have some kind of model and I want to figure out, should I send out an email, should you get email A template or B template? And then I would say, risk, if I get it wrong and you get a fully curated email B, and you would have responded better to A, risk is pretty low, right? Maybe you get slightly lower click-through rate, that's it. Let's say instead I have a product that just automatically generates the full email and sends it out to you without any kind of supervision in between. Extremely high problems, right? High risk, and you could hurt your brand, you could get into all kind of PR problems, right? So I think it's good to have like the generic conversation about it, but I think it's very important to understand that as a product manager, you can really influence the risk you're taking by looking at what is it you're trying to accomplish. And I think that user interfaces are extremely important in this. So just the difference between, let's say, I'm going to generate an email, send it out to you, or I'm going to generate an email and a marketer can look at it as a starting point and review it, approve it, and then send it out, is very big. Of course, there's still risks and everything, but it's contained in a different way. So I think that's important. And just a little remark on that and maybe this is not for this conversation, but like the whole thinking around user interfaces for these things are incredibly important, right? That can really help you navigate some of these risks to a large extent, and also just make the user experience much better. Okay, so having said that, let's go back to how we can deal with it. And this is a big problem, and that's also why I brought up that the use case, you can use that to manage your risk, and you need to think about what kind of risk do I expose myself to, depending on how I want to expose the output of the model to the end user. So there are different stages, of course. So as you mentioned, sourcing of the data for generating this big model, there's a lot of work going on filtering that. So as a normal practitioner who just wants to use the stuff, there's not a lot you can do there, except to keep an eye on what's going on, and maybe there are going to be big progress by certain teams in that direction, and you can like apply those models. There's not much you can do in terms of the data that goes into the model. But then, of course, so there's lots of different levers you have, like make sure there's a lot of testing around this, that there's representative inputs going into the model that you can then test and make sure you get meaningful outputs. And then also extremely important is that there's a meaningful feedback loop from the end user, right? So if I see something nonsensical or something that offending or something, there should be a very easy way to flag this, so it will get back to our team and the researchers, and we can improve on it, right? Because we're not going to create a system that's 100% great. But yeah, so that's extremely important, right? Because if you have a system that serves millions of requests every day, for the research team to even figure out what could be biased, what could be inappropriate, it is very difficult. So it's a simple thing, but it has to be, and I guess it goes back to the user interface, right? It has to be thought into how can the user easily engage with this and make the team aware that there may be a problem.
Thank you. I think we got time for just one last question before we go to the audience.
I was just going to add, I was going to add in there. So, and I'll answer also kind of some of the audience questions that are here at the same time. So because it happens to overlap. So I'm also part of like a local kind of like forum of like tech leaders in the Southern California area, and as you all probably know, like Los Angeles will be hosting the Olympics in 2028, right? So I think the city of LA is actually looking really high into, or like they're spending a lot of investment looking into AI, because one of the things that they want to do is put out like kiosks that have like AI assistants that help people get to the different Olympic sports or whatever it is that they're trying to do, right? So like, this kind of like addressing the public sector stuff. But the I think the core element that was missing was when you look at like the maturity of like and bias of these things, you have to have a viewpoint of like people kind of getting comfortable with the models interacting in their daily life. I think if you're kind of really embedded in it and you're using it every day, like Jenna said, like you kind of lose some of that attachment to like or worry to some extent, because it's like helping you, right? So what we've kind of been doing internal, at least, is there's a life cycle for the maturity of the models, right? Obviously, it starts at the developer, the people who are looking at it every day, and you have to have some comfort level to say like, okay, I think this is good enough to like go to the next layer of people, right? So then that would then be the other internal company people who then have to use it and gain some level of comfort around, the one model that you're trying to like deploy. Then eventually you go to maybe a focus group of people who are more inclined to tell you truthfully what they think. You maybe even have to pay them, right? But before you kind of go publicly, there's different stages that, depending on what industry or company you're in, you have to have this mindset of increasing the maturity level of your model and basically having then a platform in which when they tell you it's biased, then you can actually change something, right? And that's maybe the harder part of this, which is how do you trace back that when you had this biased response, what was like the root cause of that, and what can you do to fix it? So without getting into like too many specifics, because I think there is like a ops thing that I think we're trying to avoid talking about because it gets really deep, is you have to build out a lot of automation around testing and deploying different models, so that you can try and kind of compare the results of them, right? So like when I say you're going to a focus group, you probably don't want to go give them responses from only one model and just be like, is this good or not, right? Like what you probably want to do is have several different responses to the same question from different models and say like which one was the least biased, or which one was the most friendly, right? Like you need to kind of conduct your test in a more intelligent way, so that you can use those results to determine what is like the most viable like model that you have that you're willing to deploy, that you then put as like your product placement, right? So if you can establish a process like that, then I think even like the city of LA for the Olympics can get behind placing out the model. And then the other thing that people don't really know about who don't work in the space is if you ask the model a question like, what is the weather like today in New Haven? When that message is passed to the model, there's also something called a system message. So within the system message, there's some instruction that whoever put that thing they're talking to is also sending, which is basically like the personality of the bot. So usually it'll say something like, you're an AI weatherman, so like look up whatever and tell them what the weather's like, right? Something like that. But you can also put stuff in that system message like, do not lie, or only answer questions about the weather. So if you limit the capability of the model, you like within that system message, then when you say like afterwards, what's Professor Burnap's class schedule today, right? It'll say, I don't know, right? Whereas if you didn't put all those messages, it'll probably make something up, because that's what the model does, right? So those are kind of some of the ways to mitigate things that maybe people aren't super aware of, but like you can ask like your people who are working on it to investigate that.
Awesome. Hey, I think so. I want to build off that answer and kind of morph it into some of the audience Q&A right now. And the first one is really kind of really nicely segues with what you said. The model will just make up something, right? These are correlational models in general. They seem very the prose that they output seems very human, readable and generated, yet they're often wrong, right? This is his first question here on hallucinations, basically putting out fake news. And I'd like to maybe pass this back to Jonas, and I'm just to pick a little bit on GPT, right? So just even this year, right? GPT-4 is doing better in some ways, but just earlier this year, GPT 3.5 couldn't do most basic arithmetic benchmarks, right? Like addition and subtraction, particularly when the number of digits was over, I don't know, 4 or 5, right? Below 50% accuracy. So these things really put out a lot of hallucination if you're not careful. How do you address this, or how do you think about this? Because it's not just arithmetic. There's a very long tail of questions the set of people asking the model might want to ask.
Right. So I think there are different approaches to that. As you mentioned, GPT-4 is much better at this, and that it's going to improve just from the teams working on that. I think there are different things you can do. So one, of course, I think most real world applications are not, I think, as James mentioned, is not, just complete empty canvas and you can do whatever you want and just ask questions about random stuff. I don't want that in my product. I want guardrails around that. My product should be focused on, what the user is going to do, and not ask about the weather in New Haven, right? There are different, other places you can do that. So I think that's very important to be cognizant about, to augment the prompt with guardrails, right? That keeps the discussion within a meaningful realm that you can better control, right? So that's one thing. And then other things are around, I keep going back to interfaces a lot, because I feel like it just helps people so I guess ChatGPT is a lot like Google, right? You have one input line, you just punch in your stuff and you can do whatever you want. But in most products, you have a context and you want to, have a particular outcome. So one example from my own work is that we have this data platform. And one of the things we really want to do is to empower non-technical people to leverage the vast amount of data that's in this data platform. But before, either you had to, write SQL, which is not great for technical people, or you had to, we have a query builder, which is also a little bit clunky. And this is, LLMs just provide a completely different interface. Like, it's natural language. I can say, build me a segment of people aged between 25 and 35 who bought a handbag in California last week, and I can get that segment without understanding anything. And so there are a lot of opportunities to, in the use case, make sure that what you get out is a segment, and kind of have that system message or the augmentation of the prompt kind of just get rid of everything that has nothing to do with creating a segment in that case. So that's how I'm looking at it a lot. That really helps you in a lot of ways. Just, I guess, one final point on, if you really want to make sure that the model, the model is not built for, let's say, doing math, right? So if you really want it to be good at that, maybe you want to augment it with some third system that can go in and check this, or just run that type of question through some other resource, right? I think the same maybe for factual things, that maybe you want to look up Wikipedia or something like that directly for things like that, instead of letting it, go through a large language model. So, there are different things you can do there, but it all depends on the use case, I would say.
Yeah, so just to jump in here on the hallucinations, I think we didn't really mention this in the opening vernacular, but between kind of like the chat UI to like kind of everything in the back, there's something called an LLM orchestrator, and the one that most people are familiar with is called LangChain. So what that does is kind of what Jonas is saying, is like it's kind of arbitrary in different prompts, but there needs to be like kind of maybe more done in this area probably, but that's where a lot of, say, like compliance hallucination type solutions go that I've seen. Like essentially you're filtering some of the responses. You can also layer in like function calls within that framework. So then, like as you're saying, like if we wanted to do a very mathematical operation, we have the orchestrator do that instead of having the model handle like that bit of the answer. So but for hallucinations, really, the problem is detecting them, because it's kind of like you can only do what you know about, and it's really hard to predict like the things that you don't know about, and that's the whole crux of the problem. So that's kind of like where I got into on the system message is like the safer method potentially is to arbitrate it within your system message to limit the universe of available answers. But again, that doesn't stop an incorrect answer. So that's maybe like the hardest thing to solve.
Can we got to wrap things up pretty soon, but very similar to some of the questions asked from the Q&A on those system prompts. So as we're talking about hallucinations and the fake news and misinformation put out, Jonas talked a lot about constraining down the system to, let's say, the product's use case in particular, and evaluating the risks of that. And as well as using data to augment, whatever the tasks are to make them more factual. So to me, that it's all well and good to bring something, let's say 50% to 99% accuracy on arithmetic tasks. But then when you're in a use case like you are, James, very highly regulated industry where, even a 1 or 2% mess up on things like what is your credit score, or you can think of other industries like, prison recidivism, who do we let out, who we keep in? How do I think about hallucinations in that space? But you can put in a lot of system prompts and you might bump the accuracy up, but you're always going to have that tail.
Yeah, so I think, and this probably won't be satisfying to people, but for the regulation thing, for us at least at this point, it doesn't matter how mature your model gets. It just means if there is a key decision that involves a human's financial decision, then there has to be a human in the loop, right? So before the model itself can just make the decision on behalf, there has to be something in addition to that. Or it has to run through a function that is past all the other regulations that isn't machine learning. It's just whatever the normal process is, so to speak, right? So if it's like, can I go from being prime to or subprime to prime, then you run them through the actual function that does it. You don't do, it can't be the model that does it, right? So I would say, at least for the foreseeable future for the regulation stuff, I'd say a human should remain in the loop. I did want to just pivot slightly if we're running out. So I think there's a bunch of questions around, like, I guess all of us being in tech. I think we're just here because our industries are maybe on the leading edge of this, so we can actually comment on this. But and this comes from Gartner, so it's not just like from me, but like effectively the way that we look at the LLMs specifically is it's very similar to the cloud migration in the past in terms of like the impact, right? It's going to touch a lot of different industries, some that didn't even have to migrate to the cloud, but it's like, if you don't kind of go early on it, like at some point in the tail end, you'll kind of be forced into doing it, right? You could, I think where the decisions come in is like, do you want to be like an early adopter and kind of face some of the problems that we're talking about, or you could come in later when some of these things are more solved, right? But I think that's maybe like the core decision is like understanding that that's the kind of the magnitude of the decision, I would say. And then deciding like when versus if, I think. I mean, I think this is like one of the biggest things, and like I was saying, like the writers and actors strike, right? So like that's like an industry that wasn't touched by this, but it's gonna touch a lot of different things. So that's kind of like the thing to think about, I think.
Well, thank you so much. Jonas, you have a closing comment here related, or we're kind of wrapping?
I think it was in the description of this discussion, is this going to take my job or no? And I'm surprised that I haven't seen any questions about that. I guess we don't have time to discuss that, even though I feel like it's pretty important, but maybe for a different session.
Okay, well, without further ado, thank you so much, most importantly to James and Jonas here. And again, unfortunately, Jennifer couldn't join us today. Listen, I think all of us, I'll speak on all of us, we're all open to more conversation here, including that last comment, both our emails, as well as maybe in person if you're here. So thank you very much. Again, thank you to James and Jonas, and I will see some of you all soon.